But the good news is that Democrats in Wisconsin are fighting back, largely due to the leadership of our special guest tonight, Wisconsin Democratic State Party Chair, Ben Wickler. Ben is a real force of nature, and he's someone who has really redefined what the role of a state party chair looks like. And under his leadership, the Washington Post called the Wisconsin State Party the 2020 State Party of the Year. So now, and the reason why Ben is with us tonight is he is leading the charge for Judge Janet Protasewicz. Did I say that right? I think I got it right. But here on Team Pete, we are not daunted by complicated last names. But if you are, in this case, you can just call her Judge Janet. And if Judge Janet wins, she can help flip the makeup of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which will decide the future of democracy, women's rights, and so many other important issues in the state of Wisconsin. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ben. And then after that, we'll open it up to questions, and I'll kick it off with a few questions to Ben, but please make sure to add in any questions you have in the chat, and we'll get around to some of those as well.
Thank you so much, Liz. And thank you so much, everybody. This is an extraordinary group of folks. I'm so excited to be here. In part, for me, I'm tracing back to college when I went to college with Pete. So I've known him since we were both probably freshmen or sophomores. We would go to the Institute of Politics events. I was from Wisconsin, which I was extremely proud of and would never shut up about. And we were a state with two Democratic senators, Russ Feingold and Herb Kohl at the time. And of course, Pete from Indiana had just one Democratic senator. So, I mean, really couldn't hold a candle to Wisconsin as far as I was concerned, but he was very into that state. I grew up in a state that was a democracy and had a kind of history as the centerpiece of the progressive movement in the country. I grew up hearing stories about how Wisconsinites had written the Social Security Act and the act that created Medicare and Medicaid. Wisconsin was the first state to declare the Fugitive Slave Act unconstitutional. It had all these Civil War monuments from the winning side of the Civil War. Had the honor of being the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment, so women could vote, the first state to have legal protections for LGBTQ people, the first state to have public sector unions. We consider ourselves the birthplace of public radio. All these wonderful progressive institutions came out of our state. And I was bursting with Wisconsin pride. I'm still bursting with Wisconsin pride. Leader on the environment, founder of Earth Day, was a Wisconsinite. Aldo Leopold, that like so many wonderful things came out of Wisconsin. There's another part of Wisconsin history that I didn't like talking about so much that can trace its lineage through Joe McCarthy, who was, the most dangerous demagogues until Donald Trump came along for a very long time in American politics. A state that has some of the most searing racial disparities due to hypersegregation, which was a term coined in part based on sociologists studying what had happened in Milwaukee. A state where the Bradley Foundation, one of the big right-wing foundations, had its home in Milwaukee, and then was joined by the Koch brother network after I went to college and graduated from college. And they flipped Wisconsin completely from a blue trifecta in 2008, that was elected in 2008, to in 2010, a red trifecta, flooded with money in part from the Citizens United decision that overturned McCain-Feingold, which was the landmark campaign finance legislation that I was so proud of that my senator, Russ Feingold, who I interned for, had helped to pass. And when Citizens United came through and the dark money flooded into our state, and Reince Priebus was the Republican state party chair, you might remember him from his later exploits, and Ron Johnson was elected and Scott Walker was elected, they decided to rig the state so it could never go to Democrats or really be a democracy ever again. They did that by passing some of the most aggressively gerrymandered state legislative and congressional maps the country had ever seen. And those maps were immediately challenged in court, and Scott Walker hired a guy named Dan Kelly to represent them before the Supreme Court, but the right-wing majority on the state Supreme Court let them stand. They went after unions. They demonized teachers and state workers first and smashed public sector unions, and then, divide and conquer, they switched over to private sector unions, and Wisconsin had a bigger drop in union density than any other state in the country since 2010. And it's still falling, even though public support for unions is so high, at a record high. It's so hard to organize a union and get recognized in Wisconsin that union membership is still going down at this moment. Republicans made it incredibly hard to register to vote. We're the second hardest state in the country. They made it hard to cast a ballot. They passed a voter suppression law that a whistleblower on the Republicans who left the party after this, he said that the lawmakers in the Republican caucus were giddy, is his word, when they found out how much it would push down Black and Hispanic and young voters in our state. This was their design. This was their game plan, and it almost worked to turn Wisconsin into a permanently red state. It came this close. We saw that in 2016 when Trump won. In 2018, I moved home in 2018. I volunteered with every second I could possibly find to help elect Governor Evers. We won the governor's race by 1.1 percentage point. We swept the statewide races. In 2020, we managed to beat Trump by 0.6 of 1 percentage point. Incredibly close elections. I think they would have not been so close if it hadn't been so rigged to be hostile to voters. In 2022, we made history. For the first time in 60 years. We elected a Democratic governor. It was a re-election bid while a Democratic president was in the White House, which was great. But we lost a Senate race by 1 percentage point, and Republicans have been bragging, first privately, and then their emails were leaked, and now it's publicly, about how their work, they called it a well thought out, multifaceted plan that drove down turnout in Milwaukee, especially in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. That's a direct quote from the Republican who the Republican Party here appointed to our state elections commission, who's so proud of how successfully they suppressed the vote in Milwaukee. We're still a state that is on a knife's edge because Republicans have rigged the state. And now in this moment, we have a chance to change all of that. Because in 29 days, there will be an election for the state Supreme Court to fill an open seat, meaning there's no incumbent, there's no advantage to the incumbent, to fill an open seat for a 10-year term that will last through the next 3 presidential elections. And in that race, the guy who defended the gerrymandered maps, Dan Kelly, who I just mentioned, is the Republican candidate. He is so bad and so extreme, especially on abortion rights and reproductive freedom, on LGBTQ rights, and on questions of democracy. 3 fundamentally disqualifying areas where he puts the ultra in ultra MAGA. And on our side, we have a candidate named Janet Protasewicz, which is a name that she has a whole campaign ad of people mispronouncing. It is, you're in good company, Liz, all of us are. We have a candidate who actually takes the law and the Constitution seriously, and who is not shy about sharing that her personal value is that abortion is a choice that should be made by the person who gets pregnant, not by a politician. But she has committed to just judging things based on the law and the Constitution instead of carrying water for the extreme right that is bankrolling Dan Kelly's campaign. And in this race, if we win this race, it could change everything. It'll flip the majority in our state Supreme Court from a conservative-dominated court for the last 15 years that has stomped on voting rights, that has rigged our legislative maps and so many other things, to being a Supreme Court that will actually pay attention to the law and give democracy a chance to flourish and thrive in the state of Wisconsin. We'll talk about all the dimensions that this will have, but I'll just say we have an abortion ban that is almost total, that was passed in the year 1849. That ban is being challenged in court. It will reach the state Supreme Court after this new justice is elected, and it will go one way or another. So this is our Kansas abortion referendum. This is it. We don't have referendums in Wisconsin. This is as close as we get. And you might remember what happened in Kansas. When freedom is on the line, people step up. We have a chance to win this if we can make sure Wisconsinites know the stakes in the race, if they know this election's even happening. Almost no one votes in April. Who ever heard of an election in April? But if we get the word out, we will win this thing. And so I'm incredibly grateful for everyone's support tonight. I'm so excited to answer questions. I'm so excited to have a conversation. And I will tell you, a dollar contributed to this race goes further than just about any context I can imagine, because the stakes are so high and yet the level of information people have is so low. Every time you knock on a door, you might find a new voter who actually turns out and wins this whole thing. So with that, I'm really excited about this conversation. I'll turn it back to you, Liz.
Great, thank you. And you got to some of the questions I was going to get to in this discussion, but let's just kick it off. You talked about this a little bit. Everyone from papers in Wisconsin to the New York Times, Washington Post are calling this the most important election of 2023. And we usually don't hear that sort of hyperbole about a state level race. But can you really zero in on what the stakes are, what the really key issues are here, both for the state of Wisconsin and nationally, and what's hanging in the balance with this race?
Totally. And it's such a good question because I think the reason why national media has focused on it so much is not just because reproductive freedom is on the line in Wisconsin and the state legislature is on the line, but also because with the way that our maps are gerrymandered, the state Supreme Court, if we have a pro-freedom democracy and rule of law Supreme Court, it could strike down the gerrymandered maps, which would flip 2 House seats off the bat. Right now, Republicans have 6 out of 8 House seats in a state where we won the governor's race by 3.4 percentage points at the same time. You know something's wrong when you lose 75% of the congressional races while winning a majority in the top of the ticket race. So that could affect the House majority. The state Supreme Court in Wisconsin keeps stomping on voting rights. It banned drop boxes completely in the last midterm elections. It made it illegal to return anyone else's absentee ballot, even your own spouse or your child's. On election day, I knocked on the door of someone whose daughter had filled out her absentee ballot, gave it to her dad, left for a 72-hour nursing shift. The dad tried to return it and was told, no, you're not allowed to do that anymore. So her vote was thrown out. That kind of stuff, the state Supreme Court does that before every election. And that could affect the Senate race in 2024 when Tammy Baldwin, my wonderful senator, who I have volunteered for since she was in the state legislature and I was in high school, she's going to be up for re-election. That could affect the balance of power in the Senate. And then there's the White House, where voting rights in Wisconsin could tilt the Electoral College one way or the other. We're the tipping point state. Wisconsin is the state that put Trump over the top, I'm sorry to say, and the state that put Biden over the top. When you add up the Electoral College votes, Republicans are obsessed with Wisconsin because they know they cannot win the White House without us. So they've put the next Republican National Committee meeting here, the first GOP presidential primary debate here, and the Republican National Convention are all in Wisconsin in 2024. All their chips are on this state, and the Supreme Court is the key to their ticket to be able to pull it off. But maybe even more frightening, Dan Kelly, who's running for Supreme Court right now, he was an advisor on the fake elector scheme. He was on the Republican Party's payroll as their, quote, election integrity advisor, doing a big lie tour of the state of Wisconsin in the year 2021 and then also 2022. So even if they lose in 2024, the Republicans, they might try to overturn the election like they tried to do in 2020. In Wisconsin, they came within 1 vote on the state Supreme Court of overturning the presidential elections, the closest they came in any state. So the nightmare scenario that Republicans lose but then win anyway because they steal the election through a judicial process, Wisconsin's where that happens if they win this. And that the stakes on that have made this race a gigantic national priority for both sides. And it's why I'm so excited that everybody's here, because we need the help.
Great. And so you touched a little bit on this in your answer, but we hear a lot about gerrymandering in the national discussion in all of our individual states, but it's a really big issue in Wisconsin. So can you give us some context on the state of the maps in Wisconsin, both the state maps and the federal maps, and also why this race really matters for the maps going forward?
Absolutely. So I talked about how Republicans have 6 of the 8 congressional districts. The state legislature is in some ways even more dramatic because there are many more districts. You might by chance, win a couple of House races here or there. There are 99 seats in the state assembly. Republicans have, Democrats, I should say, have 35 of them. Republicans have 64. In a 50-50 state, they have 64 out of the 99 seats. In the state Senate, there are 33 seats. Democrats have 11. Republicans have 21. They're 1 seat away from having a supermajority, and there will be a special election on April 4th to fill the open seat where a Republican retired. So Republicans are right on the brink of having enough votes to overturn the governor's vetoes and pass whatever they want into the law. We ran a huge campaign in both 2020 and 2022 to prevent Republican supermajorities. But honestly, one bad year, they will get those supermajorities. We held them off by 1/10 of 1 percentage point of the votes cast in the state in 2022. And they smell blood, and they've drawn these maps to guarantee Republican supermajorities. Now, you might ask how that's possible when you have a Democratic governor in the state who you'd presume vetoed Republicans' attempts to gerrymander the maps. And the answer is, yeah, the governor did veto Republicans' proposed gerrymandered maps. And then the state Supreme Court's 4-3 Republican majority just went around the governor and chose the Republicans' maps anyway. It's the only court in the country in this century that just chose a completely gerrymandered set of maps drawn by one party after the governor and the state legislature deadlocked. There's no other state that has that. So that's why we're in this mess. But if we win the state Supreme Court race, we could do the same thing that we saw happen in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, progressives won the state Supreme Court majority. And then attorneys brought a lawsuit and said that under the state's constitution, those maps were unconstitutional. And the state Supreme Court ruled in their favor and ordered mid-decade redistricting, and they got fair maps, and they just won a state legislative chamber. And that could happen in Wisconsin, and it could happen fast. I know there are lawyers who are thinking about this right now. So we don't have to wait until 2030 to get the next census and do the next redistricting. This could be fixed in the next year or two if we win the state Supreme Court majority now and actually give the attorneys who are thinking about these things a fair hearing in court. That's the goal.
Great, thanks for that overview. So democracy is on the ballot with this, but we also know that women's rights to make their own healthcare decisions are on the ballot as well. And we saw in the special elections and in the general election in 2022 that abortion was a really, really big motivator for voters. So how are you seeing the issue of choice play a role in this election? And can you tell us what's at stake for women's healthcare between these two candidates and in the upcoming Supreme Court election?
This is the number one issue in this race, and it is so personal for so many people in our state. And right now, Wisconsin is in the nightmare scenario because when Dobbs came through and Roe versus Wade was overturned, suddenly people realized that there was a almost total abortion ban that was passed in the year 1849 in Wisconsin by an all-male state legislature before women had the right to vote, and certainly no women serving in the legislature. And that ban, which is written in archaic language that no one knows exactly how to medically define now, it starts at 0 weeks. It doesn't have any exception for rape or for incest or for the health of the mother. And no one knows if it's enforceable at this moment. And because no one knows, every provider of a safe and legal abortion has stopped providing abortion care, which means that if you have an ectopic pregnancy in the state and the standard of care is abortion, it's not obvious that you can get it until you have 2 different doctors certify that your life is in danger. People are bleeding for days before they get basic medical care for miscarriages. We certainly, if people need to terminate a pregnancy for whatever reason, they can't do that in the state of Wisconsin now. If you're an OBGYN trying to complete your training, you need to leave the state to finish your training. And a lot of people, frankly, don't come back. There are OBGYN practices closing right now. A movement that claims that it is pro-life is actively making it harder for people to have children in the state of Wisconsin. The question of whether the 1849 ban is enforceable, whether doctors should be thrown in jail for 6 years for a felony if they perform an abortion, that question will come to the state Supreme Court. There's a lawsuit. Governor Evers and Attorney General Josh Kaul have sued and said that law is null and void. There are other laws that have been passed since then that supersede the 1849 law. And if you just look at the law, it's pretty obvious that they're right. But we know that Dan Kelly will not do that if he wins this, because he was a paid advisor, or I don't know if he was paid. He may have been providing pro bono advice. He was a legal advisor to Wisconsin Right to Life. He's been endorsed by the most extreme anti-abortion groups not just trying to ban abortion, but also contraception, have endorsed him and are working enthusiastically, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on independent expenditures on his behalf. He is a full-on creature of the authoritarian forced birth ultra-right. And for Janet Protasiewicz, she's very clear that she thinks that this is a personal decision, and she'll actually look at the law when she makes any decision on these issues. So this question of whether this will be a state where a lot of people might really think twice about starting a family or raising a family, or whether we'll be a state where everyone is the same first-class citizen and we actually have basic freedom over our own bodies. That will be determined by this election. And that is such a powerful issue that it is the number one thing that you'll see in Janet Protasewicz's ads. And it's something we're communicating with voters all over the state. It's the first thing we talk about when we knock on doors. The shocking thing about Dan Kelly is that his big argument, it's not the shocking, a shocking thing about Dan Kelly, his argument against Janet is he says that she's using her personal opinion, replacing the law with her personal opinion. It is the biggest joke in politics because this guy, his whole thing is just carrying water for an ideological movement that is so profoundly unpopular and repellent to Wisconsinites and contrary to the law. We're just asking for a fair shake in court. And if we get that, freedom probably comes back to our state.
Ooh, that's some scary stuff. So as you can probably tell, Team Pete is full of political junkies, political nerds. You can tell that from the turnout that we have tonight. So I want to get down to a little bit of brass tacks. And before I do that, let me give a reminder to everyone here. We've got a little bit of time left. So if you have any questions for Ben, please put them in the chat, and because I would love to get around to them before we wrap. But Ben, back to you. So under President Biden in 2022, Democrats largely bucked the historical trends of a typical midterm, and we avoided, the dreaded quote unquote red wave. So can you tell us a little bit, and feel free to get granular with Team Pete, but can you tell us a little bit about what you did in Wisconsin last year, and how you helped strengthen efforts headed into this off-year election?
Absolutely. So we went into last year pretty concerned, to be honest, because Wisconsin, as a state that's almost perfectly divided 50-50, it almost always follows the pendulum where the president's party loses in the midterm. And the last time a Democrat won a governor's race in Wisconsin, when there was a Democrat in the White House, was 1962. In that year, JFK's approval rating was 70%. It was right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Democratic candidate for governor won by a single percentage point. Every time after that, if there's a Democratic president, the Republican wins the governor's race. So we went in knowing this was going to be an intense fight. I will also say we had a huge battle to stop Republicans from getting our attorney general, from getting a secretary of state. We won all of those. From stopping them from getting the supermajority in the state legislature. We averted that very narrowly. And we tried with all our might to win our Senate race. And that's the one that we lost. And I want to share a little bit about how we did it, because both the wins and the losses inform exactly what we're doing right now. So the first thing is we just never stopped after 2020. We've been organizing year-round continuously since the 2020 presidential, knocking on doors all over the state, calling people, building our neighborhood teams. We have this neighbor-to-neighbor team-based organizing system that it's just extraordinary to see. If you ever visit Wisconsin, come knock on doors with a neighborhood team and you'll see what I mean. We also worked to build a war chest. And in Wisconsin, under state law, the state party can raise unlimited amounts from individuals and transfer unlimited amounts to candidates' campaigns. And that only applies to state campaigns, meaning state legislature, governor, secretary of state, attorney general, state Supreme Court. Under federal law, the state party has a cap on what we're allowed to do for a candidate. So in the governor's race, there was a big contested Republican primary. And the second it was over, we transferred several $1 million that we'd saved up to Governor Evers' campaign, and he immediately went on the air and defined the fight and made it about this, especially about abortion and reproductive freedom, and also went after the ethics of the Republican who ran a big construction company that had a ton of sexual harassment cases that they had made giant settlements for, and he did not have a good answer for why that was the culture at his organization. So we just went after the other side, as well as lifting up our candidate. In the Senate race, Mandela Barnes, who's a great candidate, came out of the primary, a big primary, essentially broke. And the state party was not allowed to transfer money into his account. And Ron Johnson, who had been saving up for that moment, and especially his backers, Dick and Liz Uihlein and these Republican super PACs, started spending tens of millions of dollars to flood the airwaves and attack Mandela Barnes, and with some of the most vicious racist ads I've ever seen in my life. And they took him from being ahead to being behind in the 6 weeks right after the primary. once his fundraising had gotten a full head of steam, and he was able to run as many ads supporting him and attacking Ron Johnson as were coming in the other direction, he gained a point a week. His message, his campaign was strong, but he ran out of weeks. He lost by a single percentage point. If the election had been a week later, he'd had the money a week earlier, he would have won. So in this race, our strategy was to do exactly what we did in the governor's race, and frankly, what Ron Johnson did, minus the racism, in the Senate race. It was to go hard early, immediately. The day after the election, we transferred the large majority of our state party bank account into the candidate campaign account and immediately went on the air. We had all the ads for the first week of the Supreme Court race. I think we're in the lead right now because we've defined this and because we've pinpointed this issue of freedom, democracy, abortion, and reproductive freedom, and the broader freedom of living in a state where you actually have a say over what happens. We've made that the center of it. They're using the same tactic they used against Mandela Barnes. All their ads are about crime. But we know that your own freedom is actually a more powerful issue than Republican fear-mongering about crime. And we have also very strong answers on crime and public safety. Their guy, there's a lot I could say about him on that issue, but you can watch the ads if you want to learn more. So being very clear and firm from the beginning and out communicating them every step of the way and having built up and prepared for that moment so that we don't lose ground right at the beginning. Those are critical lessons that we applied from last year. And frankly, we need to do the same thing in the presidential race. They're going to have a primary. We will not, I anticipate. And we're going to be able to define them and make sure that the stakes for freedom, for democracy, for bodily autonomy are clear to people across the country. We're already thinking, obviously, about the 2024 presidential race and the Senate race at the same time as we do this. But those lessons have been critical in this race so far. And it's why if I had to bet right now, I would say we're going to win. Not that I take anything for granted, but I think we have a very, very real shot at flipping the court on April 4th.
Yeah, those are really good points. I was listening to some podcasts today with Judge Janet. I thought it was really, really smart that right off the bat, she was leading with how she had worked in the DA's office and been an advocate for victims of crime to sort of pre-butt those attacks that were coming. Now, we got some questions from Team Pete, and they did not disappoint. They really do want to get into the nitty gritty. So I'm going to try to combine some of these into one. So we have some questions from CK, from Tracy, and from Jill Zimmerman, but I'm going to go to one that hinges on turnout in the upcoming election and some of the voting questions. So with the upcoming election, what does the early voting window look like? Is there a push for absentee ballots? Are college students who are from outside Wisconsin limited in their ability to vote in Wisconsin? And I'm sorry if I'm throwing too much at you, but and then finally, what are you expecting in terms of turnout? And what are sort of the numbers that Democrats need to hit to win there?
I love these questions. This is my bread and butter. This is what I spend my day thinking about. Okay. So first, I'll talk about students. In Wisconsin, you can vote from the place where you go to school, not just from the place where you live at home. I think Republicans, if they win the state Supreme Court race, might fabricate some justification for changing that. That's one of the threats. We have 320,000 college students in our state. They already made it much harder for students to register and be able to vote. And so there's been a ton of work that universities have done to enfranchise their students. And Republicans are always trying to chip away at it. But the student vote is critical. And we've seen an explosion in student voting in the February primary compared to previous February primaries in the state Supreme Court race. I think especially because reproductive freedom is so personal to so many college students, both men and women and people across the gender spectrum. This is something that, if you're entering reproductive age, it's very, very real. So we'll be doing a ton of student voting. I will say, I often talk about how Wisconsin is the 47th hardest state to vote. The hardest state to vote is New Hampshire. If you look at the bottom of the list, it's Alabama, Texas, Wisconsin, Arkansas, Mississippi, New Hampshire. And New Hampshire is like Wisconsin in that it's a purple state where Republicans, when they have control, they rig the rules to make it harder for Democrats to ever win. So I hope we can change that in Wisconsin. I hope they change it in New Hampshire too. Absentee ballots have become a key part of how we win elections since the pandemic. We had the first election in the country when the pandemic started. It was the Supreme Court race in the spring of 2020. And we basically totally retooled our organizing program to be focused on absentee voting. So we now have tons of people who request an absentee ballot every time, hundreds of thousands, and they're overwhelmingly Democrats. And that's why Republicans have systematically targeted absentee voting through the Supreme Court ever since then, because they have done so much to drive up the rate at which absentee ballots can be rejected. We now, for people that have absentee voted before and have done it successfully, we say great, and we support them to do that, and we make sure that their ballots will be counted. But we're not trying to get new people into the absentee voting system right now, because the risk of Republicans disenfranchising them with several things that they do. So there's both a big absentee ballot chase program to make sure people who get those ballots do cast them, but we don't do a ton of getting people to request them. We do ask people to early vote. So you can early vote in person in Wisconsin 2 weeks before Election Day. That used to be 6 weeks. And then Republicans noticed that Wisconsin and Madison were doing a lot of early voting. And so they passed a lot of, cut it down to 2 weeks and won a victory in federal court with Trump appointed judges that allowed that to stand. So now it's down to 2 weeks, but it's still a huge source of votes for us. And the GOP has caught on to the fact that this helps, and they're now talking about doing it too. So we're going to be tracking very closely everything we can learn about who's early voting and absentee voting, but we know that the numbers there are going to be big, which leads to turnout. These elections are low turnout, but variable turnout. If you look at the last state Supreme Court elections, in 2018, it was 900,000 voters. In 2019, it was 1.2 million. In 2020, it was 1.5 million. That was the last state Supreme Court race here. I think it might be in the 1.5 million kind of era. It might even be a little bit higher, even though that was a presidential primary year, which was a very different environment. But this is such a hot election that people are paying so much attention to. So we've been expanding our target universe. In the February primary, turnout jumped up by 34% relative to the previous record. That is an unheard of leap. And we could be seeing record-breaking absentee voting numbers, spring election voting numbers, even though when you look at it from the other direction, that means an overall very low turnout rate. That's about half the number of people that voted in the governor or Senate race last year. So it's like low turnout relative to the number of voters, but very high for a spring election, which is why when you volunteer, and I hope everyone here will volunteer with us as well as donate, you find all these voters who are great Democrats who just don't know the election's happening and suddenly commit to vote while you're talking to them. Because once you know about how important this race is, you cannot miss this thing.
Great. I'm going to try to get in a couple more questions. We had a question from Tony that I'm just going to sort of expand on. Tony asked, is there a strategy to bring the margins down in the Northwoods so we aren't so reliant on Milwaukee and Madison? And more broadly, what is the strategy to reach out beyond the Democratic base and try to persuade people who are in the middle, who might usually vote Republican, to make sure that they turn out for the liberal candidate, Judge Janet, in this race?
It's great questions. And this is the key thing about Wisconsin. There are other states like Minnesota, half of the population lives in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, surrounded by the big city. In New York State, huge fraction of the population lives in the New York City metropolitan area. Wisconsin is different. 42% of the Democratic vote comes from rural areas. The Madison and Milwaukee metropolitan areas combined represent only 1/3 of the Democratic votes in the state, and the rest is all small and medium-sized towns and small cities around Wisconsin. So you have to organize everywhere to be able to win, even though all the national media tends to focus on Madison and Milwaukee, which are Democratic strongholds, but still a fraction of where the Democrats are. That's the reason why our organizing strategy, is building local teams that do neighbor-to-neighbor work in every corner of Wisconsin. And you can look at a map, and it looks like the population map of the state. There's dots all over the place. So we talk to people everywhere. We try to have local messengers. We have 7 different TV in-state media markets, and we also overlap with some of the Minnesota media markets. So you can have localized TV ads all over the state. Governor Evers ran digital ads customized to every one of the 72 counties with local messages. And the same team that did his ads is doing Janet Protasiewicz's ads right now. The whole key in Wisconsin is to actually tune into the folks that you're talking to. But we do know that everywhere, this question of whether we should have an almost total ban on abortion is a central question that moves people to our side. So when you ask what is the message that actually reaches out to independent and moderate voters and even some Republicans, the message of reproductive freedom is that message in this election in a way that I think people might not realize. If you knock on doors in rural areas, especially if the woman in the house answers the door, often she'll check whether her husband's listening, and then she will share that she wants to vote with us because of this issue of reproductive freedom, especially older women who remember what it was like before Roe versus Wade, when it was banned in Wisconsin. So this is a very powerful excuse me, issue. There's a lot of other issues we can dig into that we're talking about all over the state, but the number one message, if I could choose one thing for people to know when they walk into the polling place, it's that the total abortion ban will be decided by how they vote in this election, and Dan Kelly supports the ban. That's the most powerful message in this race.
That's good to know. And that brings us to our last question. And thank you to Daniel and Jill for this. And it is the most important question I am going to ask you tonight. In addition to donating, how can those people on this call who are not in Wisconsin volunteer to help? Are there phone banking opportunities, text banking opportunities, GOTV postcard drive opportunities? And what are the best ways that all of us can help marshal our time and our efforts to help make sure that Judge Janet gets elected?
I love that people feel moved to ask this, because I can't say enough how your time, especially phone banking, turns out voters in this election. Texting happens so fast that we run out of people to text, or we reach the point at which we're actively annoying people if we keep texting them. So I don't have text bank shifts for people to sign up for. There are independent groups sending millions of postcards to Wisconsin, and it is wonderful. I love it. But because of that, I'm not worried about whether there'll be enough postcards going to folks in Wisconsin. But these phone calls, if you're up for doing them, they make all the difference in the world. And in this, let me put the HTTPS into the link as well. There we go. You can click that, wisdems.org/phone bank. If you phone bank, what you'll discover, first of all, you'll be trained if you've never done it before. Our team, their whole thing is training people and supporting people. So you will have practice, you'll know how to do it. And then you'll call people who share your values, who are strong Dems, who don't know this election's happening, or who know it's happening. And I'll say, thank you, I'm so glad you're doing this, it's so important. These are not calls where you're trying to convince a former Trump voter that maybe they should see the error of their ways. These are calls where you're just telling people basic facts that lead to them wanting to cast a ballot, making a plan on the spot. I was talking to someone earlier today who had been phone banking and told me that she got to the point in her script where they said, thank you so much. Can you commit right now to asking 3 friends to vote? And the person she was talking to said, I'm actually with a bunch of my friends right now. Hey, everybody. And she heard the person at that moment convince everyone else who was in the room that they should sign up and vote for Janet Protasiewicz in the general election. It has that kind of feeling to it because the issues are so clear. And because the publicity level is so low that you become the messenger that moves people off the couch and into the ballot box. So phone bank, phone bank, phone bank. Donate whatever you can, and then use whatever time you can to phone bank. It can win us this election. And I'll close with this. I know we're running out of time. Right before I became chair in 2019, while I was supposed to be running for Democratic Party of Wisconsin chair, I would sneak off and knock on doors in a state Supreme Court race that was happening that year. Mike Shmuel, who was Pete's campaign manager, is now the Indiana Democratic Party chair, and he can tell you, you got to focus on your chair stuff when you're chair, but I can't resist knocking on doors in a campaign like that. So I was knocking on doors, and there was the sense that like things were going pretty well. But in the final stretch, the Republican dark money machine poured resources into Wisconsin and flooded conservative voters who don't normally vote in April elections with messages that got them to go and cast ballots. And Republican turnout jumped. And the progressive candidate lost that race by 5,981 votes. It was 0.4 percentage point. If we had won that year, then in 2020, after I became chair, we would have won the majority in the state Supreme Court. In 2021, we would have redistricted and had fair maps. And in 2022, Wisconsin would have been there right along with Michigan and become a blue trifecta. And Minnesota, our other neighbor, and Illinois, our southern neighbor, it would have been all blue states. And instead, because we lost by less than 1 vote per precinct across the state, we got some of the worst maps in the country and have near Republican supermajorities in the legislature while all our friends are running laps around us and passing good progressive legislation. In this election, not only are we not going to let that happen, we're going to be the ones who surge our voters, who get people who never vote in April elections to turn out and vote for state Supreme Court and take that possibility of that kind of loss completely off the table. That is the game plan, and you can make the difference in making that happen. Your financial support, your time in making those calls can win this race and win democracy in Wisconsin for the first time in a long time and help bring democracy for the whole country. So I just cannot thank you enough, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben, for taking the time to join us tonight and to really effectively lay out the stakes of this upcoming election. And of course, thank you so much to Team Pete for turning out. You guys never fail to impress me and amaze me. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Maxwell to close this all out.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. Thank you, Ben. Thank you to everyone for jumping on this call on a Monday night to hear about this important race that's coming up next month already. So there's links in the chat, but we'll also post them on social for ways to phone bank and ways to support through a contribution. But we really appreciate everyone. And we are getting started already for 2023 because there are no days off here. So we appreciate all of everyone's time and good work. And we will see you all in the next one. Take care.